Chapter 1: Origin and Early History. The Roots of the Phoenicians in Canaan. The Phoenicians are one of those peoples who never established a great empire and yet left a lasting imprint on world history. Their story begins in the area of Canaan, on the eastern Mediterranean coast, in a region that stretched roughly from present-day Lebanon through parts of Syria to northern Israel. As early as the early Bronze Age, this coastal zone was characterized by small settlements and trading centers that used their location between the sea and the mountains to establish connections in all directions. Unlike the large neighboring empires, Egypt, Mesopotamia, or later the Hittite Empire, the people of Canaan did not have a contiguous empire. Rather, they lived in city-states that were connected by trade and seafaring, and over time produced what we now call Phoenician. The term Phoenicians does not come from their own language, but was coined by the Greeks. They called the inhabitants of the eastern Mediterranean coast Phoeniques, which goes back to the Greek word for purple. In doing so, they referred to the most famous trade commodity of these peoples, the purple dye, which was extracted from the shells of the murex snail. But there was no uniform name for the Phoenicians themselves. They identified with their cities, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Arados, and saw themselves less as part of a people than as citizens of a city-state with its own traditions, kings, and gods. The origins of the Phoenician culture lie in ancient Canaan. Archaeological finds prove that the region was inhabited since the 3rd millennium BC and maintained early contacts with the great civilizations of the Orient. Byblos, for example, has been an important partner of Egypt since early times. From here, cedar wood was exported, which was highly sought after in the Nile Valley due to the lack of high-quality woods. Egyptian inscriptions mention Byblos as a trading center, and Phoenician princes maintained close contacts with the pharaohs. In this way, a culture grew up that thrived on exchange and whose identity was shaped by seafaring and trade from an early age. Geographical conditions played a decisive role in this development. The coast of Canaan was rich in natural harbors, bays, and headlands suitable for shipbuilding. Behind the coast rose the Lebanon Mountains, whose forests were filled with mighty cedars and pines. This wood was not only an export good, but also the basis for shipbuilding, which made the Phoenicians the seafarers of the Mediterranean. In addition, the country was located at a crossroads of cultures. Trade routes crossed here, leading from Mesopotamia to Egypt and from Anatolia to the Red Sea. In this transition zone, a culture emerged that knew how to absorb, process, and pass on influences. Politically, the early Phoenicians were part of the changing power relations of the ancient Near East. Sometimes under Egyptian domination, sometimes dependent on the Hittites or Assyrians, they lived in a constant field of tension between greater powers. But it was precisely this situation that brought them advantages. They had to be flexible, adapt, and form alliances, but at the same time they retained a certain independence. No great power could permanently control the entire coast, and so the cities of the Phoenicians remained centers of relative independence for centuries. The early days of the Phoenicians are therefore characterized by a mosaic of small centers of power. Each city had its own king, its own sanctuaries, and its own trade networks. Sidon is considered one of the oldest. Tyre would later become the most powerful, and Byblos was a religious and cultural center that was closely linked to Egypt. This diversity prevented the emergence of a Phoenician empire, but at the same time made the cities adaptable and open to innovation. Religiously and culturally, the early Phoenicians stood in the tradition of Canaan. Their world of gods was closely related to that of the Canaanites, who often appear in the biblical texts as neighbors of the early Israelites. Baal, the god of weather and fertility, played a central role, as did Astarte, the goddess of love and war. Melqart, the city god of Tyre, became a symbol of Phoenician power and later also worshipped in colonies such as Carthage. This religion was strongly local, but in its entirety it created a spiritual world that combined trade and seafaring with rituals, myths, and symbols. The Phoenicians are also linguistically rooted in Canaan. Their language belongs to the group of Semitic languages, related to Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. This language later developed into the Phoenician alphabet, one of the most important inventions in human history. Early on, the Phoenicians used characters to record trade agreements, religious texts, and diplomatic correspondence. In doing so, they laid the foundation for a cultural tradition that had an impact far beyond their own borders. The early history of the Phoenicians is thus the history of a culture that arose between the great powers of the Orient, asserted itself through trade and seafaring, and formed a unique identity. The Canaanite cities developed into the trading centers that were to shape the Mediterranean. From the very beginning, the Phoenicians were a people of coasts, ships, and open horizons. They saw the sea not as a border, but as a path, and this view determined their fate for centuries to come. Chapter 2: Geography and Cities, from Tyre to Byblos. The world of the Phoenicians was inextricably linked to the geography of their homeland. Trapped between the Mediterranean Sea in the west and the steep Lebanon mountains in the east, they lived on a narrow coastal strip that was only a few kilometers wide. This geographical narrowness shaped their culture, their economy, and their way of life. While in the hinterland fertile valleys and mountain paths made contact with Syria and Mesopotamia possible, in the west the sea opened up as an infinite horizon, as a path to foreign countries, and as a source of wealth and adventure. The cities of the Phoenicians were pearls on this coast, each with its own identity, history, and importance. Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and Arados were the main centers, but they were never part of a unified empire, but independent city-states that competed with each other and were at the same time bound by common interests. Their location on the coast made them ideal transshipment points for trade between east and west. From the mountains behind them they obtained wood, resins, and metals, from the sea fish and the famous purple snails, and from faraway merchants came with gold, ivory, and spices to exchange these goods. Byblos is considered one of the oldest cities in the region and played a prominent role in early times. As early as the 3rd millennium BC, it was a close partner of Egypt. Large quantities of cedar wood were loaded here, which were urgently needed in the Nile Valley to build temples, ships, and palaces. The relations were so close that Egyptian inscriptions describe Byblos as a kind of outpost of the pharaohs. At the same time, the city developed into a cultural center where scrolls made of papyrus were traded. So close was this connection that the name Byblos later even became the Greek word for book and resonates in our term Bible. Sidon was another important center. The city was famous for its skilled craftsmen who produced glassware, jewelry, and elaborate textiles. Sidon was also an important port from which Phoenician traders sailed to Egypt, Anatolia, and the islands of the Mediterranean. The city enjoyed prestige for centuries, but its supremacy changed over the course of history as competition with Tyre became increasingly fierce. Tyre eventually developed into the most powerful of all Phoenician cities. Its location was particularly favorable. The old town center was originally located on an island off the coast, protected by the sea and fortified by huge walls. This insularity made Tyre almost impregnable, an advantage that has proven itself several times in history, even though Alexander the Great eventually had a causeway built to conquer the island. Tyre was not only militarily strong, but also economically significant. From here, the Phoenicians controlled many of their colonies, including Carthage, which later became a great power in its own right. The city god Melqart became a symbol of the power of Tyre, and his cult spread far beyond the Mediterranean. Further north was Arados, on a small island off the Syrian coast. This city also benefited from its insular location and became an important base for trade and seafaring. Although Arados was never as powerful as Tyre or Sidon, it still played a central role in the network of Phoenician cities. Together with smaller settlements, these centers formed a dense network of ports and trading centers that lined the coast like hubs. The geographical location of these cities made them intermediaries between land and sea. In the hinterland, caravan routes led to Mesopotamia, Persia and Arabia, from where luxury goods such as spices, incense, and precious stones were brought in. These goods were shipped in the ports and thus reached the Mediterranean countries, where they met with great interest. Conversely, Aegean ceramics, Egyptian gold, and African ivory reached the Middle East via the Phoenician ports. The Phoenicians owed this role as mediators and traders not least to their geography, which inevitably gave them an orientation towards the outside world. The climate and natural resources also determined the development. The coast was fertile, suitable for olives, wine, and grain, but the quantities were not sufficient to feed large populations. Thus, the cities were dependent on imports, which additionally promoted trade. The cedar forests of Lebanon were a wealth of a special kind. This wood was not only of excellent quality, but also a rare commodity in the ancient world. It became the most important export product and established the prosperity of the cities, especially in the early centuries when Egypt needed huge quantities of it. However, the strategic location also made the Phoenician cities sought-after targets for conquerors. Egyptian pharaohs, Hittite kings, Assyrian and Babylonian rulers, they all tried to gain influence on the coast. But the cities remained tough and resilient. They paid tributes, adapted or cleverly changed sides in order to preserve their independence. Geography forced them to engage in diplomacy, but at the same time their walls, ports and fleets gave them the means to assert themselves. The Phoenician cities were not metropolises in the modern sense, but they connected the world. From Tyre to Byblos stretched a chain of ports that linked the Mediterranean with the cultures of the Middle East. Each city had its own peculiarities, but together they created a culture that saw the sea as a lifeline. The geography of Canaan was not a disadvantage, but an invitation to trade, seafaring, and expansion. The narrowness between the mountains and the sea gave rise to an openness to the world that made the Phoenicians the great mediators of antiquity. Chapter 3: Society and Culture, Traders, Seafarers, and Craftsmen. The image of the Phoenicians is inextricably linked to that of the merchant and navigator. No other ancient culture was shaped by the sea in such a way. No other was so masterful in shaping a social and cultural fabric based on trade, crafts, and seafaring from its geographical location and natural resources. The society of the Phoenicians was by no means homogeneous, but characterized by a clear structure that ranged from the kings and upper classes in the city-states to the simple craftsmen and slaves. But in contrast to their agrarian neighbors, the life of the Phoenician cities was defined less by land ownership and more by work on and with the sea. At the center of society were the kings and the leading families, who at the same time controlled the trade. Unlike in large empires, where the nobility and landed property decided on power, in the Phoenician city-states it was mainly trading dynasties that determined the reputation. These families owned ships, trading rights, and influence over the city's foreign policy. They provided the financing of expeditions, provided captains, and commanded the crews. Their power was not based on huge estates, but on the profits from the exchange of goods over long distances. The merchants formed the backbone of society. They were the ones who crossed the Mediterranean with ships, called at ports, and returned exotic goods. A Phoenician merchant was not only a merchant, but also a diplomat, interpreter, and adventurer. He had to be able to negotiate with foreign peoples, understand their language and customs, and in case of doubt, also ensure his own safety. The reputation of the Phoenicians as cunning and sometimes devious merchants is widespread in ancient sources, but it also testifies to their ability to assert themselves in the most diverse contexts. Next to the merchants stood the sailors, the real heroes of Phoenician culture. Without them, the trade networks that stretched from Spain to Mesopotamia would have been unthinkable. The seafarers were not only rowers and sailors, but also carried the technical knowledge necessary for navigation, shipbuilding, and survival on long voyages. They knew the coastlines, the currents and winds, and their experience was passed down from generation to generation. The Phoenicians were not conquerors who transported huge armies across the sea, but merchants who, through their ships, transformed the Mediterranean into a network of connections. However, the society of the Phoenicians was not only characterized by merchants and seafarers, but also by craftsmen who lived and worked in the cities. In Sidon and Tyre, workshops were established in which glass was blown, jewelry was made, and purple fabrics were dyed. The purple was a symbol of the wealth of the upper class. The production of the dye from the tiny glands of the murex snail was extremely complex, and the division of labor within the workshops shows how complex the craft was organized. The Phoenician craftsmen were also highly regarded in metalworking, ivory carving, and shipbuilding. They exported not only goods, but also their knowledge. The cultural identity of the Phoenicians was strongly influenced by their international role. Since they were in contact with Egyptians, Greeks, Hittites, and Mesopotamians, they constantly absorbed influences and at the same time passed on their own ideas. This led to a culture of openness and flexibility. In the Phoenician cities, the people spoke foreign languages in addition to their own language, knew the religions and customs of other peoples, and knew how to behave diplomatically. This ability to mediate between cultures made the Phoenicians indispensable actors in the ancient world. Everyday life in the Phoenician cities reflected this international character. Markets were filled with goods from a wide variety of origins: grain from Egypt, wine from Greece, tin from Britain, spices from Arabia, and jewelry from Anatolia. Women also played an important role, especially in the religious and economic spheres. Although society was organized patriarchally, Phoenician queens and priestesses are mentioned several times in the sources, and women were able to exert influence in the workshops and trade. The lives of ordinary people were also determined by trade and crafts. Many people worked as sailors, porters, craftsmen, or in the purple and glass workshops. There were also slaves who had either become dependent on debts or had come as booty from trading trips and battles. These slaves were part of the economic system, but their numbers were smaller compared to the great empires. The cities of the Phoenicians did not live from huge estates and mass slaves, but from the specialized work of many small groups. The culture of the Phoenicians reflected the diversity of their contacts. Their art was influenced by Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece, but they also developed their own forms. Especially the depictions of ships, gods, and mythological scenes testify to a world that focused on the sea. Music and dance accompanied religious festivals, and rituals were held in the temples that served both the gods and the community. To sum up, Phoenician society was a unique mix of traders, sailors, and craftsmen who lived in a confined space and drew their strength from openness to the world. They were not farmers who farmed the land on a large scale. They were not warriors who raised huge armies, and they were not emperors who established an empire. They were mediators, bridge builders between cultures. Their cities were hubs of trade, their ships the veins of the Mediterranean, and their culture a mirror of the world they connected. Chapter 4: Religion and the World of the Gods, Baal, Astarte, and Melqart. The religion of the Phoenicians was a mirror of their world, shaped by the coast, the sea, the mountains, and the constant encounters with foreign cultures. It was deeply rooted in the traditions of Canaan and closely related to the beliefs of neighboring peoples such as the Hebrews, Arameans, and Ugarites. But it also developed its own forms and accents, which became particularly visible in the large city-states. The Phoenician religion was polytheistic, full of local cults, and infused with a variety of deities, each with their own tasks, attributes, and sanctuaries. At the top was Baal, the Lord, who was worshipped as the god of weather and fertility. Baal was a god of power, rain, thunder, and thus the basis of all life in a region where precipitation decided on prosperity and ruin. He was the fighter who fought against forces of chaos, such as the sea or the underworld, and preserved the order of the world. His veneration was associated with sacrifices that could range from fruits to animals to people, with the accusation of human sacrifice in particular occupying the ancient sources again and again. For the Phoenicians themselves, however, Baal was a guarantor of fertility, protection, and victory. In addition to Baal, Astarte played a central role. She was a goddess of love, fertility, but also of war. This double figure combined the gentle and the wild, the birthing and the destructive. Astarte was worshipped in temples with ostentatious rituals, and their priesthoods had great influence. Its cult spread far beyond the Phoenician cities and was also received in Greece and Rome, where it was associated with Aphrodite and Venus, respectively. Astarte embodied the feminine principle, but she was far more than a goddess of sensuality. She also represented the power that protected cities and kings, and her images adorned coins, statues, and votive offerings. The cult of Melqart was particularly strongly anchored in Tyre. He was considered a city god and protector, at the same time the god of seafaring, kings, and enterprise. Melqart was a god who could die and rise again, a symbol of renewal and rebirth. His cult accompanied the Phoenician traders and colonists, who took him to all parts of the Mediterranean. Temples to Melqart were built in Carthage, Cadiz, and Malta, and even the Greeks saw in him an equivalent of Heracles. Melqart thus became one of the deities who supported the identity of the Phoenicians abroad and at the same time formed a bridge to other cultures. The Phoenician religion was to a large extent local. Each city had its main god, its sanctuaries, and its festivals. In Byblos it was the goddess Baal at Jebel, in Sidon the goddess Astarte, in Tyre Melqart, and in Arados other patron gods were worshipped. Nevertheless, all these local cults were united by a common foundation, the close relationship between deity, city, and king. The ruler was not only the secular leader, but also the supreme servant of the deity who protected the city. Temples and palaces often stood side by side, and religious rituals were part of the political order. The cults were permeated by a rich symbolism. Statues, cult images, and sacred symbols adorned the temples. Sacrificial altars were erected on which animals were burned or food was laid down. In some cases, especially in Carthage, ancient sources report child sacrifices offered to the gods to avert particularly grave dangers. Archaeological finds, which contain so-called Tophet sites with urns of burned children's bones, give indications that such practices existed at least in parts of the Phoenician world. Although modern research disputes the extent to which they actually occurred, it is clear that the religion of the Phoenicians was characterized by a seriousness and sacrifice that evoked both admiration and disgust in the ancient world. Another characteristic was the importance of festivals and rituals. These were not only religious acts, but also an expression of social community. Processions through the streets, sacrificial acts, and festivals in the temple connected the people with their gods. The cult was not limited to a small priesthood, but part of everyday life. Families made their own sacrifices, merchants consecrated statues, and kings donated large temple complexes. In the colonies, religion was a means of maintaining ties to the homeland, even if the Phoenician settlers lived far away. However, the Phoenicians were also pragmatic people. Their religion was open and receptive. They adopted gods and rites of other peoples, adapted them to their own traditions. Thus, their deities merged with those of Egypt, Greece, or Mesopotamia. Baal could be equated with Zeus, Astarte with Ishtar or Aphrodite, Melqart with Heracles. This ability to conform to religion was an expression of the same flexibility that guided their trade. It made it possible to gain a foothold in foreign ports without coming into conflict with local cults. In Phoenician society, religion was not only an expression of faith, but also a means of legitimation and power. Kings had temples built to consolidate their rule, and priestly houses had an influence on political decisions. Temples were also economic centers in which riches were collected, trade treaties sealed, and warehouses built. The connection between religion, politics, and economics was indissoluble, and the world of the gods was part of the network that held Phoenician culture together. This shows that the religion of the Phoenicians was not a static system, but a living, flexible world deeply embedded in everyday life. Baal, Astarte, and Melqart were the focus, but behind them lay a broad pantheon and a variety of local traditions. This religion accompanied the Phoenicians in their cities, on their ships, and in their colonies. It created an identity that had an impact across all borders and contributed to the Phoenicians becoming not only traders but also cultural mediators. Chapter 5: Politics and Royalty, City-States Instead of Great Empire. The political structure of the Phoenicians was fundamentally different from that of the great empires that surrounded them. While Egypt, Assyria, or Babylonia established centralized systems of rule with huge armies and bureaucratic apparatuses, the world of the Phoenicians remained a world of city-states from beginning to end. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Arados, and many smaller cities were separate political entities that had their own kings, administration, and interests. This fragmentation was not a sign of weakness, but an expression of a different form of political organization, which resulted from geography, economics, and culture. The narrowness of the Phoenician coastal strip did not allow for a large area. Instead, life was concentrated in individual port cities, each with its own hinterland, trade routes, and deities. Each city was a small kingdom of its own, with walls, temples, and a king at the top. This king combined secular and religious functions. He was head of the army, protector of the city, and at the same time supreme servant of the main deity. In Tyre he was in the service of Melqart, in Byblos in the service of Baal. The legitimacy of the rule was based not only on military strength, but also on religious consecration. The kingship in the Phoenician cities was mostly hereditary, but the power of the kings was not unlimited. They were integrated into a network of influential trading families, priesthoods, and city councils. The great merchant dynasties in particular had a decisive influence on political decisions due to their wealth. They financed fleets, expeditions, and constructions, and their consent was necessary to implement foreign policy strategies. This created a kind of hybrid form between monarchical and oligarchic rule. The king was the face of the city, but behind him were powerful elites who supported or limited his actions. The city-states were in constant tension with each other. They were allies in trade, rivals in competition, and opponents in wars. Tyre and Sidon, for example, alternated in their supremacy, and smaller cities had to lean sometimes on one side, sometimes on the other. These rivalries prevented the emergence of a Phoenician empire, but at the same time ensured a dynamic political landscape. Each city had to react flexibly, form alliances, and defend its fleets and walls in an emergency. The foreign policy of the Phoenician cities was characterized by pragmatism. Since they did not have large armies, it was impossible to stop the expansionist drive of the great powers militarily. Instead, they relied on diplomacy, tribute payments, and clever tactics. When Egypt was powerful, they sent gifts to Pharaoh. When Assyria advanced into the Middle East, they paid tributes and provided ships. This submission was often more formal than real, because in everyday life the cities remained largely autonomous. They knew that no great power could permanently control the narrow coast, and they used this situation to their advantage. At the same time, political fragmentation was one of the greatest weaknesses of the Phoenicians. When Alexander the Great came to the east, one city after another fell because there was no common defense. Tyre was able to hold out for a long time, but without the support of the other cities, this fortress was also doomed. The lack of unity prevented the Phoenicians from holding their own against external threats. Their strength lay in trade and diplomacy, their weakness in the lack of military solidarity. Nevertheless, the importance of the political order should not be underestimated. The city-states allow for a high degree of flexibility and adaptability. Each city could make its own decisions, open trade routes, or found colonies, regardless of a central empire. This resulted in an extensive network of Phoenician settlements that stretched across the entire Mediterranean. This diversity was only possible because there was no central control that focused resources on a single goal. Instead, each city pursued its own strategy, and together they formed a mosaic of centers of power connected by their ships. An interesting feature of Phoenician politics was also the role of religion. Since each city had its own main god, religion was an integral part of political identity. Whoever entered the temple of Melqart in Tyre also entered the heart of political power. Festivals, rituals, and sacrificial acts were not only religious, but also political events that brought the people together and strengthened the king's rule. Temples were also economic centers where treasures were stored and trade treaties were concluded. The internal administration of the cities was organized pragmatically. There were councils that advised the king, officials in charge of trade, construction, and security, and priesthoods that ran the cult and temple. Written documents preserved on Phoenician inscriptions show that agreements, contracts, and decrees were recorded. Thus, the Phoenician cities were not only religious and economic, but also administrative centers that produced an astonishing organizational achievement. The political culture of the Phoenicians is thus a countermodel to the great empires of antiquity. It shows that power does not necessarily have to be based on an empire, but can also endure in the form of small independent city-states. This form of organization enabled the Phoenicians to maintain their independence for centuries, even if they were formally under Egyptian, Assyrian, or Persian rule. They paid tribute, but they largely determined their trade routes and colonies themselves. In summary, the political structure of the Phoenicians was characterized by diversity, pragmatism, and local identity. Not a great empire, but a mosaic of cities made up their world. This order brought rivalries and weaknesses, but it also laid the foundation for one of the most successful trading and seafaring cultures of antiquity. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Arados were not capitals of an empire, but independent poles connected by their ships and networks. In their totality, they were stronger than many an empire because they did not conquer the world, but connected it. Chapter 6: The Invention of the Alphabet, from Phonetic Sign to World Revolution. When talking about the greatest achievements of the Phoenicians, one invention stands out that fundamentally changed world history: the alphabet. While many of their cultural achievements, such as shipbuilding, trade networks, or purple production, had an impact especially in the Mediterranean region, the development of a writing system based on simple phonetic signs was a revolution that went far beyond its own culture. The idea of capturing language in a small number of clear characters changed not only the way people wrote, but also the way they thought, communicated, and preserved knowledge. Before the Phoenicians developed their alphabet, complicated writing systems dominated the Middle East. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform writing was used on clay tablets, a technique that involved thousands of characters and required years of study. In Egypt, hieroglyphics shaped the monuments, an equally complex system of pictorial signs that was religiously and symbolically charged. Both systems were powerful, but they were also difficult to access. They required a specialized class of scribes who managed knowledge in a monopoly-like manner. Writing was a tool of administration and temples, rather than a means of broad communication. The Phoenicians, on the other hand, merchants and sailors, had a different need. They needed simple, practical handwriting that quickly and clearly recorded contracts, trade agreements, lists of goods, and diplomatic messages. From the tradition of the Canaanite languages, they developed a script that required only a few characters. Each character stood for a sound, not for a syllable or an image. With 22 characters, the entire language could be reproduced. These signs were easy to learn, could be carved or painted on papyrus, parchment, wood, or stone, and they did not require long training. This made writing a tool that merchants, craftsmen, or diplomats could also learn. The invention of the Phoenician alphabet is usually dated to the 2nd millennium BC, probably in the vicinity of the cities of Byblos and Sidon, where there were close contacts with Egypt and Mesopotamia. Archaeological finds such as the inscriptions of Byblos or the so-called Hiram sarcophagus from the 10th century BC show early forms of this writing. The signs were still angular and simple, but they already reflected the basic principle, a sign for a sound, without superfluous symbols or complicated syllable structures. This simplification was a revolution. It made writing flexible, portable, and universal. It could be adapted for different languages without having to learn thousands of characters. This made the Phoenician alphabet the first truly global writing system. It spread over the entire Mediterranean Sea with the traders and colonies of the Phoenicians. In Greece, people adopted the alphabet, adapted it to their language, and added vowels. The Greek alphabet later evolved into Latin, which is still used today in large parts of the world. The Hebrew and Aramaic alphabets also have their roots in Phoenician, as does Arabic. The spread of the alphabet was a cultural process that was closely linked to the trade routes of the Phoenicians. Wherever they founded their colonies, in Cyprus, North Africa, Sicily, or Spain, they left their writing. Merchants carved messages into stones. Priests wrote dedications for temples. Kings had inscriptions made to immortalize their deeds. The alphabet was more than a tool, it was part of a new way of thinking. Language was reduced to its sound structure, communication was standardized, and knowledge was democratized. The importance of this development can hardly be overestimated. Without the Phoenician alphabet, Greek philosophy would not have been handed down in written form, Roman law would not have found a basis, and the Christian Bible would not have come into being in the form that made it the world religion. The Phoenicians themselves probably had no idea what effect their invention would have, but they created the basis for a written culture that continues to this day. The alphabet was also an expression of the pragmatic spirit of the Phoenicians. It was not a magnificent script for monuments and temples, but a practical tool for everyday life. Its strength lay not in aesthetic beauty, but in functionality and simplicity. This sobriety corresponded to the mentality of a culture characterized less by conquest than by trade and exchange. Even though the alphabet was the most important written invention of the Phoenicians, it should not be forgotten that it was part of a larger cultural process. The Phoenicians took ideas from Egypt and Mesopotamia, reduced them and adapted them to their needs. This ability to adapt, simplify, and pass on was typical of her. They did not create a completely new world, but combined existing elements in new ways. The Phoenician script remained in use for centuries and was still alive in its original form even in the time of Alexander the Great. In colonies such as Carthage, it developed its own variants, and even in remote regions of the Mediterranean, inscriptions have been found that testify to the presence of Phoenician traders. This writing was the silent foundation on which cultural exchange was based. This shows that the invention of the alphabet was not only a technical innovation, but a turning point in human history. The Phoenicians gave the world a tool that facilitated access to knowledge, communication, and memory. In a world where power was often demonstrated by monuments and armies, they created a quiet, inconspicuous, but incomparably more powerful form of rule, the rule of writing. Chapter 7: Trade and Networks. Purple, Glass, and Precious Metals. Trade was the lifeblood of Phoenician culture. In a world where other peoples increased their power through conquest, agriculture, or tribute, the Phoenicians created a system based on exchange, connections, and networks. Their cities lay like pearls on the coast, but their true significance lay not in the land behind them, but in the trade routes that stretched across the Mediterranean and far beyond. Their nets stretched from the Atlantic coasts of Spain to the deserts of Arabia, and the goods they moved were as varied as they were coveted. The most famous product of the Phoenicians was purple, the deep red dye extracted from the glands of the murex snail. The production was laborious and time-consuming, because thousands of snails had to be collected and processed in order to obtain small amounts of paint. But the result was unique. a hue of such intensity that in ancient times it was associated with royalty, wealth, and power. Purple fabrics from Tyre were so expensive that they were reserved only for kings and priests. The Romans later called it purpura tyriensis, and made it a symbol of imperial dignity. For the Phoenicians, purple was not just a product, but a trademark that made their cities famous. In addition to purple, glass played a central role. As early as the 2nd millennium BC, Phoenician workshops were known for their glass art. Whether glass vessels, pearls, or jewelry, the craftsmen of the coastal cities knew how to bring the material into artistic shapes. In Sidon in particular, workshops were established whose products were exported to all parts of the ancient world. Glass was not only a luxury good, but also a testament to technical skill and creative design. In later centuries, the Phoenicians were considered by many cultures to be the inventors of glassblowing, a technique that revolutionized the production of glass. The Phoenicians also played an important role in the metal trade. Copper from Cyprus, silver from Spain, tin from Britain, these metals reached the Middle East via Phoenician traders. Tin in particular was invaluable, as it was necessary for the production of bronze. The Phoenicians connected the regions where metals were mined with the markets where they were needed. Their ships transported raw materials as well as finished products, and their networks ensured that no region remained isolated. However, the strength of the Phoenicians lay not only in individual products, but in their ability to weave a complex trade network. They were the mediators between the cultures. From Egypt they brought gold, linen, and papyrus. From Mesopotamia, spices, precious stones, and handicrafts. From Anatolia, wood, horses, and metals. From Spain, silver and tin. From Africa, ivory, ostrich feathers, and exotic animals. In their markets, these goods were side by side, and their ships made them accessible to the entire Mediterranean world. A special feature of Phoenician trade was its flexibility. Merchants not only traveled between large centers, but also established small trading stations on remote coasts. There they exchanged simple goods for raw materials with local tribes. Ceramics, jewelry, or tools from the Phoenician cities could be of inestimable value to foreign peoples, while wood, metals, or animals were coveted trade goods for the Phoenicians themselves. This ability to integrate even the most remote regions into the internet made them the real globalizers of antiquity. The Phoenician trade networks were also politically significant. Often, colonies were not founded out of military ambition, but as safe havens for trade. Carthage, for example, was originally built as a Phoenician settlement to secure access to the rich resources of North Africa and Spain. Such colonies were also established in Cyprus, Sicily, Malta, and on the Atlantic coast of Spain. They were not only transshipment points, but also cultural bridges where Phoenician, Greek, Egyptian, and indigenous influences mixed. However, the networks were not limited to the Mediterranean. Archaeological finds indicate that Phoenician traders sailed as far as the coasts of West Africa and possibly even reached the Black Sea. There are reports that they even circumnavigated Africa on behalf of the Egyptians. Although these stories are difficult to verify, they show the reputation of the Phoenicians as fearless seafarers who did not shy away from the coast. Economically, trade was the engine that kept the cities of the Phoenicians alive. Since the coastal strips offered little space for large-scale agriculture, the supply of grain and other staple foods was dependent on imports. Trade thus ensured not only wealth, but also survival. Markets in Tyre, Sidon, or Byblos were filled with a variety of products that reflected the international role of the cities. At the same time, trade also shaped the mentality of the Phoenicians. They were a people who were attuned to profit, exchange, and movement. Their culture was less static than that of large agricultural empires, but dynamic, open, and adaptable. They absorbed influences, adapted them, and passed them on. Her religion merged with foreign gods. Her art took up foreign motifs. Her writing spread across all borders. But the trade also brought dangers. Wealth aroused covetousness, and the great powers of Assyria, Babylonia, or Persia regarded the Phoenician cities as worthwhile targets for tributes and conquests. Again and again, the Phoenicians had to use their ships and goods in the service of these powers or pay tributes in order to preserve their autonomy. Nevertheless, the trade network remained in place because it was useful for all sides. Even the most powerful conquerors had an interest in keeping the merchants at work, as they could not replace their skills and networks. Thus, purple, glass, and metals were not only trade goods, but symbols of a culture that ensured its survival through exchange. The Phoenicians were not warriors who subjugated countries, but merchants who made connections. They made the Mediterranean a common space in which goods, ideas, and people circulated. Their trade was not only an economic practice, but a form of diplomacy and cultural mediation. In this role, they created a legacy that shaped antiquity and had an impact far beyond. Chapter 8: Shipbuilding and Navigation. Masters of the Mediterranean. The heart of the Phoenician world beat on the sea. Their cities were like windows to the Mediterranean, and their ships were the tools with which they expanded their power, wealth, and influence. Without their mastery of shipbuilding and navigation, the Phoenicians would have remained nothing more than a collection of small coastal peoples. But they knew how to use their country's natural resources, refine technical knowledge, and turn the narrowness of their coastal strip into an open connection to the entire known world. The basis for this success lay in the cedar forests of the Lebanon mountains. The wood of the cedars was hard, durable, and at the same time easy to work with. Early on, the Phoenicians used this raw material for shipbuilding, and their ships were famous throughout the Mediterranean. Egyptian inscriptions prove that as early as the 3rd millennium BC, cedarwood was brought from Byblos by sea to the Nile Valley to be used for boats, temples, and palaces. This wood was not only an export good, but also the key that made the Phoenician cities themselves shipping powers. The Phoenician shipbuilders developed different types of ships that were tailored to different tasks. Merchant ships were wide, stable, and designed to transport large quantities of goods. They could load amphorae full of wine, oil, or grain, as well as heavy metal ingots or purple fabrics. Warships, on the other hand, were narrower, faster, and more maneuverable, equipped with rowing benches and sails to be able to flexibly switch between speed and power. The famous biremes and later triremes, which were also used by Greeks and Romans, had their roots in Phoenician architecture. Another characteristic of the Phoenician ships was their characteristic bow, often decorated with animal heads or symbols of the gods. These were not only decorative, but also had a symbolic function, promising protection on the dangerous journeys across the sea. At the stern was the rudder, which was operated by experienced helmsmen who mastered the art of navigating against wind and current. The combination of sailing and rowing allowed the Phoenicians to stay on course even in adverse conditions, making them more independent of the whims of nature than many of their contemporaries. In addition to shipbuilding, navigation was an art mastered by the Phoenicians. They were guided by the stars, the movements of the sun, and the coastlines. The North Star in particular served them as a reliable guide on the high seas. They knew the currents of the Mediterranean, the trade winds, and the seasons that made certain routes easier or harder. Their knowledge was not only practical experience, but systematically passed on knowledge that was passed down from generation to generation. These abilities allowed the Phoenicians to sail farther than other peoples of their time. Their ships reached Cyprus, Crete, and the Aegean Sea, later also North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain. There are even reports that they sailed around Africa on behalf of the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II in the 6th century BC, an undertaking that, if historically accurate, demonstrated the possibilities of seafaring centuries before the expeditions of modern Europe. There are also indications that they reached the shores of Britain to buy tin for bronze production. The ships of the Phoenicians were floating trading centers. Contracts were concluded on them, goods were exchanged, and new contacts were made. Their ports served as hubs, but the ships were the real nerve pathways of trade. They connected the cities of the coast with the colonies and markets in the distance. Without these fleets, there would have been no Phoenician diaspora, no foundation of Carthage, no spread of the alphabet. The fleets also played a role militarily. Although the Phoenicians were not a warlike people in the classical sense, their ships could be used in war, whether to defend the ports, transport troops, or attack enemy shores. Again and again, great powers such as the Assyrians or Persians used the ships of the Phoenicians in their military campaigns, as they had the necessary knowledge and the best materials. Thus, the fleets were not only tools of trade, but also instruments of political power. The role of seafarers in society was correspondingly highly regarded. They were considered men of courage and experience who conquered the sea and supplied the cities with wealth. Their songs, stories, and traditions shaped the culture, and the gods of the Phoenicians, especially Melqart, were closely associated with seafaring. Sacrifices were made in the temples for safe travel, and the return of a ship was always a solemn event. Shipbuilding and navigation made the Phoenicians the masters of the Mediterranean, as they were later called by the Greeks. They connected regions that had previously been isolated and turned the sea into a space of exchange. While other people saw the sea as a border, the Phoenicians saw it as a road that expanded their world. This shows that her mastery of shipbuilding and navigation was more than technical skill. It was an expression of an attitude that did not fear the sea, but saw it as an opportunity. The Phoenicians did not build empires with armies, but with ships. They did not conquer countries, but markets. And they did not leave behind an empire of stone, but a network of ports, trading centers, and memories that shaped the history of the Mediterranean for centuries. Chapter 9. Colonies, from Cyprus to Carthage. The Phoenicians were not only traders, but also pioneers in the art of colonization. While other peoples founded colonies out of military urges or to secure conquests, the Phoenicians did so for economic and practical reasons. Their cities on the Levant coast were prosperous but cramped, agricultural land was limited, and the population grew. At the same time, trade drew them further and further afield, and the ships that opened up new markets needed safe harbors to take on supplies, make repairs, and trade. Thus, over centuries, Phoenician colonies were formed, which spanned the Mediterranean like a net and formed the basis for their lasting influence. The first steps towards colonization led to Cyprus. The island was rich in copper, a metal that was indispensable for the production of bronze. As early as the 2nd millennium BC, traces of Phoenician presence can be found in Cyprus, where they not only established trading posts, but also founded permanent settlements. Here, the Phoenician heritage combined with the local traditions and the Greek influences, which were also strong. Cyprus became an important hub from which traders could reach the east as well as the Aegean and western Mediterranean. From there, the network continued to expand. The Phoenicians left their mark in the Aegean, Crete, and Rhodes, but their real strength lay in the western areas, where they beat competitors such as the Greeks. Phoenician settlements were established in Malta, Gozo, and Sicily, which were later developed from Carthage. These islands were not only intermediate stations, but also production centers where Phoenician craftsmen worked and spread their art. A particularly important step was the expansion into North Africa. Along the coast, the Phoenicians founded numerous colonies, including Utica and Hippo Regius. They were the starting points for the trade in the rich resources of the hinterland. Ivory, gold, and exotic animals from Africa ended up in the Mediterranean. The most important foundation, however, was Carthage, which, according to legend, was founded in the 9th century BC by Queen Dido. Carthage began as one of many Phoenician settlements, but due to its favorable location and the energy of its inhabitants, it quickly developed into a power that surpassed the mother cities in importance. The Phoenicians also left their mark on the Atlantic coast. In southern Spain, in the area around Gadir, today's Cadiz, they built one of their westernmost bases. There they controlled access to the silver mines of the Iberian Peninsula. which were one of the most important sources of precious metals in antiquity. Gader became one of the richest Phoenician colonies and also served as a gateway to the Atlantic. From there, Phoenician traders are said to have sailed even further north, to the coasts of Britain, to acquire tin, which was essential for the production of bronze. These colonies differed in structure from the colonies of other peoples. They were rarely places of military subjugation or large-scale settlement. Instead, they were trading bases, often built in cooperation with the native tribes. The Phoenicians brought tools, jewelry, ceramics, and luxury goods, which they exchanged for raw materials. They used diplomatic skills to come to terms with local rulers and relied on integration instead of oppression. This made their colonies resilient and encouraged cultural exchange. The colonies were also cultural bridges. With them, the Phoenician script, religion, and craftsmanship spread throughout the Mediterranean. In Carthage, for example, the god Melqart was worshipped, but here he took on a new form and merged with local traditions. This gave rise to an independent culture that had Phoenician roots, but grew into a new center in North Africa. The art of purple production, glass processing, and the alphabet also spread through these settlements. The importance of the colonies lay not only in their economic value, but also in their strategic function. They formed a chain of safe harbors that enabled the Phoenicians to dominate the entire Mediterranean with relatively small ships. Without these intermediate stations, long journeys would have been impossible. Each colony was like a knot in a net that stretched from the Levant coast to the extreme limits of the known sea. The colonies also had political consequences. Since the mother cities such as Tyre or Sidon never formed a fixed empire, many colonies developed a great deal of independence. Carthage in particular soon broke away from Tyre and went its own way until it became a great power in its own right. This shows that Phoenician colonization was not centrally controlled, but was driven by economic interests and local needs. Each colony was part of the whole, but also independent enough to act independently in times of crisis. The colonies of the Phoenicians made them the real globalizers of antiquity. They connected the eastern Mediterranean with the western, North Africa with Europe, the silver mines of Spain with the markets of Mesopotamia. At a time when the sea was a border for many peoples, the Phoenicians turned it into a road that extended their culture in all directions. Thus, colonization was not a secondary aspect, but a core part of the Phoenician identity. It ensured not only trade, but also the survival of a culture that had limited resources in its homeland. It made the Phoenicians a people defined not by land, but by sea and networks. Their colonies were the visible signs of a cosmopolitanism that made them incomparable mediators of antiquity. Chapter 10: Phoenicians and Egypt, Between Tribute and Cooperation. The relations between the Phoenicians and Egypt are among the oldest and most important connections that this merchant and seafaring people have maintained in the course of their history. Egypt was a great power whose wealth, culture, and charisma influenced the entire eastern Mediterranean region for thousands of years. For the Phoenicians, whose cities were only a few days' journey away from the Nile Delta, the land on the Nile was a natural partner, but also a powerful ruler to whom they occasionally had to submit. Between dependence and cooperation, between tribute and exchange, a relationship developed that shaped both sides and increased the importance of the Phoenician cities far beyond their narrow coasts. The connection can be proven as early as the 3rd millennium BC. The city of Byblos, one of the oldest Phoenician trading centers, was in close contact with the Egyptian pharaohs. In Egyptian texts, Byblos appears as Gubla, a place from which the coveted cedar wood was obtained. This wood was invaluable to Egypt, as there were hardly any forests in its own country. Temples, palaces, ships, and coffins of the pharaohs were made of Lebanese cedar wood. Early on, the Phoenicians established their role as suppliers of a raw material that was not only practical, but also symbolic. Cedar wood stood for durability, strength, and divine shine. But the relationships were not limited to wood. Other goods also reached Egypt via Byblos: silver, copper, resins, oils, and purples. In return, the Phoenicians received gold, linen, papyrus, and artistic works by Egyptian craftsmen. Papyrus was particularly important for the trading cities, as it became indispensable as writing material and laid the foundation for the spread of written culture. These early exchange relations show that the Phoenicians were not just middlemen, but active partners in a system that connected the Middle East with Egypt. Over time, a more complex political dimension developed. Egypt repeatedly regarded the Levant coast as an area of influence that had to be controlled. As early as the Middle Kingdom, Egyptian campaigns moved into the region to demand tributes and secure the trade routes. Later in the New Kingdom, under pharaohs such as Thutmose III or Ramses II, the Phoenician cities came even more under Egyptian domination. They had to pay tributes, provide quotas for the construction of temples or the equipment of armies, and prove their loyalty. But the Phoenicians knew how to take advantage of this dependence. By being able to supply Egypt, their cities remained privileged partners and benefited from the protection of a great power. Egyptian reliefs show embassies from Byblos, Sidon, or Tyre, which bring rich gifts, but also symbolize solidarity. In the Phoenician cities themselves, temples were built that absorbed Egyptian deities, and art adopted Egyptian motifs, whether in sculptures, jewelry, or architecture. This cultural exchange was a hallmark of the Phoenician world. Instead of resisting, they absorbed influences, modified them, and made them part of their own identity. With the decline of Egyptian power in the first millennium BC, the situation changed. While Egypt was weakened by internal crises and foreign conquerors, the Phoenicians gained more independence. Their trade networks now expanded unhindered to the west, and they founded colonies that strengthened their independence. Nevertheless, Egypt remained an important market. Phoenician traders continued to bring wine, oil, glass, and luxury goods to the Nile, while gold and grain found their way back. In the late period, when Egypt itself was dominated by Assyrians, Persians, and later Greeks, the Phoenicians were often used as partners of these new masters. Their ships and their sailors were in the service of the great powers, even if they ruled Egypt. This meant that the links with Egypt remained indirect, even if the country's political role fluctuated. It is particularly striking how strong the cultural ties remained. Phoenician religion and Egyptian gods influenced each other. Some Phoenician deities took on Egyptian features, while Phoenician symbols appeared in Egyptian works of art. The death cult of the Phoenicians also bore traces of Egyptian influences, for example in the design of sarcophagi and grave inscriptions. The legend of Osiris and Isis resonated in the coastal cities and merged with the myths of Melqart and Astarte. The relationship between the Phoenicians and Egypt was therefore not a one-sided dependence, but a dynamic interplay. Sometimes the cities were vassals, sometimes equal trading partners, but both sides always benefited from each other. Egypt gained access to resources it did not possess through the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians used the power and cultural splendor of the Nile country to increase their own importance. In the end, it was the Phoenicians who had a more lasting effect with their heritage. While Egypt's influence fluctuated and eventually declined, the Phoenician colonies spread their culture as far as Spain and North Africa. But without the close connection to the country on the Nile, without the early exchange of wood, gold, and papyrus, this development would hardly have been possible. Egypt was the first great partner of the Phoenicians, a partner that shaped them, but at the same time helped shape them. Thus, the relationship between Egypt and the Phoenician cities remains an impressive example of how trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange functioned in antiquity. It shows that power and dependence were shaped not only by conquest, but also by networks. In this respect, the Phoenicians were masters at finding the balance between tribute and cooperation that ensured their own survival and prosperity. Chapter 11: Encounters with Mesopotamia, Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians. The geographical location of the Phoenicians between the great powers of Egypt and Mesopotamia made their history a constant balancing act between self-assertion and subordination. While the sea opened up opportunities for them, the land powers in the east brought pressure and threats again and again. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, and finally, the Persians had a profound influence on the political and economic development of the Phoenician cities. Nevertheless, the traders and seafarers on the Levant coast managed to assert their role as mediators and to preserve their independence, at least in part. The encounter with the Assyrians was marked by violence, demands for tribute, and military pressure. As early as the 9th century BC, the Assyrian kings moved their armies to the coast to demonstrate their power to the Phoenician cities. Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos had to pay tributes in the form of silver, gold, purple fabrics, and exotic goods. Assyrian reliefs show Phoenician embassies delivering these duties as a sign of submission. But at the same time, the Assyrians knew about the value of the Phoenicians. Their ships were indispensable for the empire's military campaigns and trade. The Assyrian rulers repeatedly forced them into service, for example in the construction of fleets for military expeditions. Despite this subordination, the Phoenicians knew how to take advantage of their situation. As long as the tributes were paid on time, the Assyrians allowed them a certain autonomy. The cities were able to maintain their trade networks, and it was precisely under Assyrian rule that their connections extended as far as Mesopotamia. Phoenician merchants brought wood, wine, oil, and luxury goods to the cities on the Tigris and Euphrates, while they brought back metals, grain, and handicrafts from there. Thus, despite their political dependence, they were not only subjugated, but also necessary partners who connected the empire with the Mediterranean world. In the 7th century BC, the Phoenician cities experienced hard times again when Sidon rose up against Assyrian rule. The uprising was brutally suppressed, the city was destroyed, and many residents were abducted. Tyre, however, held out longer and was able to gain time again and again through skillful diplomacy and the protection of his island position. The Assyrians besieged the city several times, but its walls and fleet made it almost impossible to take it. This struggle shows that the Phoenicians, although small in number, had the means to stand up to even great powers. With the decline of Assyria in the late 7th century BC and the rise of Babylon, the balance of power shifted. The Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar II continued the policy of oppression and made Tyre in particular their target. The city was besieged for 13 years, an unprecedented undertaking, but one that did not lead to full capture. In the end, Tyre had to make concessions, but its walls remained unbroken. This episode was later highlighted by historians as an example of the Phoenician spirit of resistance. Babylonian rule was difficult for the coastal cities, but it did not bring complete subjugation either. Under the Persians, the situation changed fundamentally. When Cyrus the Great conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire in the 6th century BC, the Phoenician cities also became part of the vast Persian Empire. But unlike the Assyrians and Babylonians, the Persians treated the Phoenicians with greater respect. They recognized the value of their fleets and trade networks and made them allies. Under Darius I and Xerxes, Phoenician ships played a decisive role in the wars against Greece. In the famous Battle of Salamis, many ships of the Persian fleet were under Phoenician command, even if they suffered a defeat there. For the Phoenicians, the Persian period meant a phase of relative stability. Their cities were able to develop their economic strength while at the same time being put at the service of the great empire. Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos remained important centers that benefited from the protection of the Persian Empire, even if they had to give up some of their independence in return. The Persians, on the other hand, used the Phoenician seafarers to secure their rule in the Mediterranean region and rewarded them with trade privileges. This eventful history shows that the encounters with the great powers of Mesopotamia were ambivalent. On the one hand, the Phoenicians were forced to pay tributes, perform military service, and bow to political control. On the other hand, they always knew how to play out their indispensable role as traders and seafarers. They were not simple victims of the great powers, but actors who found their niches in the play of forces. Culturally, the influences were profound. Assyrian and Babylonian art, architecture, and religion left their mark on the Phoenician cities. Conversely, the Phoenicians brought their own traditions to Mesopotamia, whether in the form of luxury goods, craftsmanship, or religious ideas. In particular, the art of glass production and purple production were admired in the East, while the Phoenician script also became known in these regions. In the end, it was probably precisely this ability to balance between subordination and independence that ensured the Phoenician survival. They knew when they had to pay tributes, when resistance made sense, and when cooperation promised the better benefits. Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians came and went, but the Phoenician cities survived. Their secret lay in their flexibility, their economic importance, and their ability to use the sea as a shelter and opportunity. Thus, the encounters with Mesopotamia were not only a story of oppression, but also proof of the tenacity and adaptability of the Phoenicians. They learned to survive in a world of great empires without ever building an empire themselves. And this is precisely where their historical greatness lies. They preserved their identity by bowing to the powerful, but at the same time going their own way, the way across the sea, which they made their real allies. Chapter 12. The Phoenician Diaspora, Traders between Orient and Occident. The Phoenicians were a people who found their identity not only in the narrow coastal strip of their homeland, but far beyond. While other cultures sought their center in the country, in fixed borders or in empires, the strength of the Phoenicians lay in the movement. Their real home was the sea, and their true community spanned ports, islands, and trading stations that formed a vast network like hubs. This network was the basis for the Phoenician diaspora, a dispersal of traders, settlers, and seafarers who connected the Mediterranean region and built bridges between the Orient and the Occident. The beginnings of this diaspora lay in the need for raw materials and markets. The homeland of the Phoenicians was rich in wood, purple, and glass, but it was poor in metals and agricultural land. This shortage drove them out early on, first to Cyprus, where copper was mined, and then on to Asia Minor, Greece, and North Africa. They left traces everywhere, be it in the form of small trading posts, temporary camps, or permanent colonies. Their presence was not militarily enforced, but was based on exchange, diplomacy, and trade. The diaspora became particularly visible in the Western Mediterranean world. In Sicily, Sardinia, and Malta, the Phoenicians founded settlements that were not only transshipment points, but also cultural centers. There they met Greeks, indigenous peoples, and later Romans, and everywhere they knew how to take on their role as mediators. They brought not only goods, but also ideas, their writing, their religion, their craftsmanship. This interpenetration of different traditions made their colonies places of encounter that developed their own dynamics. In Spain, especially in Gadir, today's Cádiz, the Phoenician diaspora reached one of its greatest blooms. The city, founded in the 9th century BC, became a center of the silver trade and at the same time a gateway to the Atlantic. From here, Phoenician ships sailed north to fetch tin from Britain, and perhaps even west, all the way to the shores of Portugal or beyond. Gadir was not just a colony, but a metropolis where traders, craftsmen, and sailors from all parts of the Phoenician network came together. It connected the resources of the West with the markets of the East, thus turning the entire Mediterranean world into a single trading area. The diaspora also had a religious dimension. Wherever the Phoenicians settled, they brought their gods with them. Temples for Melqart, Astarte, or Baal were located in Carthage as well as in Spain or Cyprus. These sanctuaries were not only places of faith, but also centers of community that gave identity to the scattered merchants. They connected the colonies with their homeland and strengthened the feeling of a common culture. At the same time, the deities adapted to local traditions, merged with foreign religions, and thus became part of new cultural syntheses. The social structure of the diaspora was characterized by flexibility. Merchant families settled in foreign cities, married local women, learned new languages, and created mixed communities. But despite this integration, they preserved their own customs, their script, and their religion. This ability to adapt without losing one's own identity was the secret to the success of the Phoenician diaspora. It made the Phoenicians ideal cultural mediators who could mediate between Orient and Occident, between Africa and Europe, between coasts and islands. Politically, the diaspora was ambivalent. On the one hand, the colonies created a network of bases that strengthened the power of the Phoenician cities. On the other hand, many of these places developed an independence that separated them from the mother cities. Carthage in particular is the most famous example here. Originally a colony of Tyre, it developed into the leading power in the western Mediterranean, building an empire of its own, dwarfing the ancient cities of the Levant. This development shows that the Phoenician diaspora meant not only an expansion, but also a transformation of the culture. Economically, the diaspora was invaluable. It secured the flow of raw materials, metals, and luxury goods, without which the hometowns could not have prospered. At the same time, it made it possible to bring goods from the Levant to remote regions, where they were highly regarded. Purple fabrics from Tyre, glassware from Sidon, carvings from Byblos, all these products found buyers in the colonies and were distributed there. The colonies were thus not only consumers, but also multipliers of Phoenician culture. The diaspora also had a symbolic meaning. It showed that the Phoenicians were a people without fixed borders, defined by connections, not territories. Their strength lay not in walls and armies, but in ships, ports, and trade routes. Where other peoples saw the sea as a threat, the Phoenicians saw it as a habitat that connected them. Their colonies were an expression of this attitude: flexible, open, adaptable communities that could put down roots wherever there was trade and exchange. Thus, the Phoenician diaspora was not only a side aspect of its history, but its actual core. It made the Phoenician citizens of the world of antiquity, traders between Orient and Occident, bearers of a culture that transcended borders and connected spaces. Their traces are still visible today, be it in the ruins of Carthage, in the remains of Malta, or in the myths of Carthage. They did not leave behind an empire in the classical sense, but they created a network that was as powerful as any empire. Chapter 13: War and Defense, Sieges, Walls, and Mercenaries. The Phoenicians were not a people who went down in history through conquest. They did not build large land armies, did not found an empire held together by force, and did not shape the image of invincible generals. Their strength lay in trade, seafaring, and diplomacy. But that does not mean that they were defenseless. On the contrary, their cities were protected by mighty walls. Their fleets could also be used in military conflicts, and if necessary, they resorted to mercenary armies. War and defense were a matter of survival for the Phoenicians, because their position between great powers made them repeatedly the targets of sieges and attacks. The Phoenician cities were vulnerable by nature. They were located directly on the coast, with a narrow hinterland that offered hardly any protection. Land armies could invade from the east, while enemy fleets threatened from the sea. The answer to this situation was massive city walls, which offered protection not only symbolically, but also practically. Tyre in particular was famous for its fortifications. The city consisted of a part on the mainland and an offshore island surrounded by high walls. These walls made Tyre almost impregnable, as evidenced by several sieges in history. Even powerful rulers such as Nebuchadnezzar II or later Alexander the Great had to make tremendous efforts to conquer the city. Sidon, Byblos, and other cities also relied on strong walls, which were often reinforced with towers and made it difficult for the attackers to penetrate. These buildings were an expression of Phoenician pragmatism. Knowing that their cities were small and not protected by large armies, they relied on passive defense. Walls became the silent guarantors of their survival, and they were also symbols of independence, signaling to any attacker that a quick victory was impossible. In addition to the walls, the fleets played a central role in the defense. Although Phoenician ships were primarily built for trade, they could also be used for war. The narrow, fast warships were able to fight enemy fleets or break sieges from the sea. The Phoenician sailors were considered experienced fighters who acted at sea with arrows, spears, and rams. Their ships were also valued by foreign rulers, so that they participated in many major conflicts as allies or vassals. However, when it came to large land armies, the Phoenicians were at a disadvantage. They did not have the population or the organization to raise their own armies of significant strength. Instead, they resorted to mercenaries. This practice was widespread in antiquity, but it was particularly important for the Phoenicians. They hired fighters from neighboring regions, Libyans, Iberians, Greeks, or even Celts, and used them in their services. Especially later, in the context of Carthage, the tradition of mercenary armies became a decisive element of Phoenician warfare. However, dependence on mercenaries was not without risks. Loyalty had to be paid, and it was not uncommon for riots to break out when wages were not paid. The most famous episode was the mercenary war in Carthage after the First Punic War, when dissatisfied troops rebelled against their employers. This example shows that the strength of the mercenaries could also be a weakness. Sieges were always a reality for the Phoenicians. Their cities were rich booty, and powers such as the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, or Greeks had a great interest in controlling them. But the Phoenicians developed a remarkable resilience. Tyre, for example, was besieged by Nebuchadnezzar for 13 years without the city being conquered. Only Alexander the Great managed to storm the walls through an unprecedented technical masterpiece by having a dam built to the island. This episode shows how extraordinarily difficult it was to conquer a Phoenician city. The Phoenicians also relied on diplomacy as a means of defense. It was often wiser to pay tributes, enter into alliances, or put one's own fleet in the service of a great power than to go into open combat. This pragmatic attitude ensured them a certain degree of autonomy for centuries, even if they were formally under foreign rule. For the Phoenicians, war was rarely an end in itself, but always a means to maintain their own position or avoid losses. It is interesting to note that war and defense were not as glorified in Phoenician culture as they were in other societies. There are few reports of heroic battles or glorious campaigns. Instead, the pride of the Phoenicians lay in their ability to survive despite all threats and to reassert their cities again and again. Their heroes were not generals, but kings who held their walls, merchants who traded even in times of war, and sailors who opened up new markets at risk. But war also left its mark. Many Phoenician cities were destroyed and rebuilt several times. Every siege brought losses. Every submission claimed tributes and human lives. Nevertheless, the cities remained, and their culture survived because it did not rely on military power. Instead, it was the resilience of their walls, the skill of their diplomats, and the adaptability of their traders that secured them a lasting role in history. Thus, the history of Phoenician warfare shows a paradoxical picture: a people who avoided war, but nevertheless repeatedly became the target of attacks; a culture that did not fight major battles, but nevertheless survived through defense and steadfastness; a society that drew its strength not from armies, but from walls, fleets, and networks. For the Phoenicians, war was not a means of expansion, but a test that they had to pass again and again, and which, despite all the defeats, never allowed them to go down completely. Chapter 14: The Founding of Carthage, Dido and the New Home. The history of the Phoenicians is inextricably linked to the founding of Carthage, the city that later rose to become the great power of the Western Mediterranean as heir to the Levant states. While the mother cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos were often under threat from great powers such as the Assyrians, Babylonians, or Persians, Carthage was a new center that emerged from a colony and was ultimately to have a decisive influence on the history of antiquity. The founding of the city is shrouded in myths that are closely linked to the figure of the legendary Queen Dido, but at the same time it is a mirror of Phoenician necessities, the search for security, trade, and a new home. According to legend, it was Dido, also called Alyssa, who founded Carthage. She was the sister of the king of Tyre and, according to tradition, fled her homeland after a bloody power struggle. Accompanied by followers and loyalists, she sailed west to build a new city in a foreign land. In North Africa, she met the ruler there, who assured her of as much land as she could span with an ox skin. Dido cut the skin into thin strips, marking a large area where Carthage eventually emerged. This cunning founding myth shows the ingenuity and cleverness that characterized the Phoenicians, and has been passed down for centuries by Greeks and Romans. Historically, Carthage was founded in the 9th century BC, probably around 814 BC. The city was located in a prominent location. A sheltered bay provided a safe anchorage, and its location between the eastern and western Mediterranean made it an ideal hub for trade. From here, ships could sail to Spain to fetch silver and tin, to Sicily and Sardinia to acquire grain and metals, or to North Africa to exchange ivory, gold, and exotic animals with the native peoples. Soon, Carthage developed from a simple base to a thriving city. Merchant families from Tyre and other Phoenician cities settled, bringing with them their religion, their writing, and their craftsmanship. But the new city was not only a reflection of home, but also a place of fusion. It absorbed influences from North Africa, integrated elements of local cultures, and developed its own identity, which was influenced by Phoenician influence but nevertheless became independent. Carthage differed from many other Phoenician colonies in its rapid development. While many settlements remained small trading posts, Carthage quickly became a center of power and influence. Its location made it possible to control trade routes, and its population grew strongly. As early as the 7th century BC, the city was so important that it increasingly pursued its own interests, independent of Tyre, which was under Assyrian pressure at the time. Religion also played an important role in Carthage. As in Tyre, Melqart was worshipped as a patron god, but here he took on new traits that connected him more closely to local traditions. Astarte, Baal, and Tanit also became central deities, whose temples shaped the city. This religious continuity ensured that the Phoenician identity was preserved even at a distance, while at the same time an independent Carthaginian tradition emerged. The defense of the city was a central aspect from the beginning. Carthage received strong walls that protected it against attacks, and early on the city became a maritime power, whose fleet controlled not only trade but also the security of the coasts. This combination of trade and defensiveness made Carthage an exception among the Phoenician colonies, which usually relied more on diplomacy and walls than on the establishment of a powerful naval state. Dido's role remained alive in the collective memory even after its founding. The Romans in particular took up the figure in their literature. In Virgil's Aeneid, Dido becomes the tragic queen who takes in the Trojan hero Aeneas, falls in love with him, and finally, abandoned by him, seeks death. This literary treatment shows how strongly the fascination of Carthage and its mythical foundress also had an effect in later centuries. Although the historical figure Dido is difficult to grasp, his myth symbolizes the combination of cunning, suffering, and power that shaped the history of Carthage. In its early days, Carthage was still closely connected to Tyre, possibly paying tributes and being in exchange with the mother city. But the stronger Carthage became, the more independent it became. While Tyre suffered under the burden of the Assyrians and Babylonians, Carthage gained strength and influence. Thus, the center of the Phoenician world slowly shifted from the Levant to North Africa. The founding of Carthage was more than the emergence of a new city. It was a turning point in Phoenician history. A community was born here that preserved the traditions of the Levant, but at the same time expanded them and adapted them to new conditions. Carthage was not only a refuge for refugees like Dido, but a symbol of the resilience and foresight of the Phoenicians. A small colony became an empire that would challenge Rome itself centuries later. Thus, the founding of Carthage remains a key moment in Phoenician history. It shows how necessity, trade, and cunning gave rise to a city that not only preserved the heritage of the Phoenicians, but redefined it. Carthage became the new homeland, the new power, and finally the actual heir of a culture that shaped the Mediterranean without ever having founded a unified empire. Chapter 15: Carthage as Phoenician Heritage, Rise to Great Power. With the founding of Carthage, the Phoenician world had gained a new center, but what began as a colony quickly developed into an independent power that not only inherited the Levant cities, but soon far surpassed them. While Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos gradually lost influence under the rule of the great powers of the Orient, Carthage blossomed into the leading maritime power of the Western Mediterranean. In this development, the heritage of Phoenician culture was combined with a political and military strength that the old city-states on the coast of Canaan had always lacked. Carthage became a great power that shaped the balance of the Mediterranean region for centuries. The foundations of this rise lay in the strategic location of the city. Carthage had been founded in a fertile region of North Africa that had not only good ports but also a rich hinterland. Unlike the mother cities in the Levant, Carthage was not enclosed by narrow mountain ranges, but could fall back on the plains of Africa, which made agriculture and population growth possible. This hinterland was the basis on which a stable community could develop, which was not only based on trade, but was also strengthened by the food security of its inhabitants. From the beginning, however, maritime trade played a central role in the rise of Carthage. The city was located at the interface between the eastern and western Mediterranean, and was thus able to direct the flow of goods in both directions. Silver from Spain, tin from Britain, metals from Sardinia, grain from Sicily, ivory and gold from Africa. All these goods passed through Carthaginian ports and made the city rich. Merchant families built networks that tied in with the traditions of Tyre, but Carthage surpassed its mother city in the scope and systematic nature of its trade relations. While the Phoenician cities in the east were often under pressure from foreign conquerors and could only maintain their independence through tribute payments, Carthage took a different path. The city developed a strong fleet that not only protected trade, but also served as a tool for expansion. As early as the 6th century BC, Carthage controlled large parts of the coasts of North Africa, numerous islands such as Malta, Sardinia, and parts of Sicily, as well as important bases in Spain. This expansion was not supported by huge land armies, but by naval supremacy, which allowed Carthage to blockade its opponents, dominate trade routes, and secure colonies. The political structure of Carthage also reflected the Phoenician heritage, but with its own characteristics. The city was not ruled by a single king, but by a complex system of sefeits, elected judges or magistrates, a council of elders, and a popular assembly. This mixture of aristocratic rule and republican elements gave Carthage stability and allowed it to avoid concentration of power in the hands of individuals. At the same time, this reflects the pragmatic attitude of the Phoenicians. Power was not sacred, as in Egypt, but a question of consensus and trade. Militarily, Carthage, like its mother cities, relied on mercenaries, but on a larger scale. Libyans, Iberians, Numidians, Greeks, and Celts fought on behalf of the Carthaginians, while the native citizens mostly manned the fleet. This practice made Carthage a flexible but also vulnerable power. The strength of its armies depended on pay and loyalty, and conflicts such as the mercenary war after the First Punic War show how fragile this system could be. Nevertheless, Carthage made it possible to raise powerful armies in a short time without placing an excessive burden on its own population. Culturally, too, Carthage remained firmly rooted in the Phoenician heritage. The gods Baal, Hammon, and Tanit became central deities, and their cults shaped religious life. Melqart, the city god of Tyre, was also worshipped and symbolized the connection to the old homeland. The Phoenician tradition remained alive in architecture, writing and crafts, but it merged with African, Iberian, and Greek influences to form an independent Carthaginian culture. The rise of Carthage inevitably brought the city into conflict with other powers. Initially, it was the Greeks who fought for influence in Sicily. For centuries, Carthaginians and Greeks fought bloody conflicts there, which determined the balance of power in the western Mediterranean. Later, an even more dangerous opponent appeared: Rome. The collision between the old Phoenician trading power and the emerging Roman Republic led to the Punic Wars, which are among the largest and most bitter conflicts of antiquity. But before Carthage was in open enmity with Rome, it was a symbol of the success of Phoenician culture. The city proved that the Phoenicians could do more than just be traders and mediators. In Carthage, they had shown that they were able to create a politically stable, economically strong, and militarily assertive community. Here, the old maritime heritage of the Levant was combined with the possibilities of a rich African hinterland, and from this grew a great power that dominated the West for centuries. Carthage was thus not only a colony, but the actual successor of the Phoenician world. While the ancient cities on the Levant perished or disappeared into the structures of other empires, Phoenician culture lived on in North Africa, transformed, expanded, and strengthened. Carthage was proof that the Phoenician model of trade, seafaring, and flexibility was not only suitable for survival, but also for domination. Thus, the rise of Carthage stands for the second heyday of the Phoenicians. It shows that their legacy did not end with the decline of Tyre or Sidon, but lived on in a new form. The city on the African coast became a shining example of how a culture without a large land empire could nevertheless become a great power, a legacy that still fascinates today and underlines the unique place of the Phoenicians in world history. Chapter 16: Arts and Crafts, Ivory, Metal, and Glass. The Phoenicians have historically become known primarily as traders, seafarers, and colonizers. But all their economic success would hardly have been conceivable if they had not also been able to produce goods of extraordinary quality that were coveted beyond the borders of their homeland. Arts and crafts were not just a byproduct of trade, but a central part of Phoenician identity. They combined technical skill with aesthetic flair and made the Phoenicians masters in the processing of materials that were often supplied to them from distant countries. Among these materials, ivory, metal, and glass occupied a prominent position. Ivory was one of the most valuable raw materials available to the Phoenicians. It did not come from their immediate homeland, but was imported from Africa or India, often through Egyptian mediation. In the workshops of Byblos, Sidon, or Tyre, this precious material was processed into the finest works of art: small jewelry boxes, furniture decorations, statuettes, and reliefs, often decorated with scenes from mythology or everyday life. The mixture of styles that is visible in these works is particularly striking. Phoenician craftsmen combined Egyptian motifs with Mesopotamian forms and created something of their own from them, which nevertheless seemed familiar. This ability to fuse different traditions made Phoenician ivory coveted throughout the ancient world. Many pieces found their way to Assyria, where they decorated palaces, or to Greece, where they were considered luxury goods. Metal played an equally important role. Copper from Cyprus, silver from Spain, iron from Anatolia, and gold from Africa were brought to their homeland by Phoenician traders and processed there. The Phoenician bronze works were particularly famous. They ranged from everyday objects such as lamps or vessels to artistically decorated cult objects. Bronze bowls with engravings, helmets with figurative decorations or artistic fittings show that the Phoenicians were not only merchants, but also true masters in metalworking. Here, too, the international nature of their culture is reflected. Motifs from the Orient, Egypt, or even early Greece merged into an unmistakable style. Gold and silver jewelry from Phoenician workshops was coveted throughout the Mediterranean world. Rings, bangles, necklaces, and amulets showed fine workmanship and often religious symbols. The wealth of the merchant families was reflected in such pieces, but they also had a high value as trade goods. Phoenician jewelry appears in archaeological finds from Cyprus to Spain, a testament to the reach of their craft. Particularly noteworthy is the glass, for which the Phoenicians became famous. As early as the 2nd millennium BC, the Levant was a center of glass production, but the Phoenicians brought this art to new heights. Glass beads, small vessels, and ornately decorated pendants were among the most popular export items. The secret of their glass production lay not only in the technique, but also in the coloring. Using metal salts, the Phoenician craftsmen succeeded in producing glass in bright tones of blue, green, and red, which were considered particularly noble in antiquity. Glass was easier to transport than metal and was valued in all parts of the Mediterranean. The Phoenician craftsmen were not only technicians, but also artists. Her works show a great attention to detail and a remarkable ability for miniaturization. Small pieces of jewelry or ivory inlays were made with such precision that they are considered masterpieces even in modern eyes. But they also had a feeling for larger forms. Monumental statues, temple decorations, and large metalwork prove that they knew how to work in all scales. Another characteristic of Phoenician art was its functionality. Unlike many cultures, which created art primarily for religious or representative purposes, the Phoenicians combined beauty with practical value. A cup was not only a drinking vessel, but also a work of art. A jewelry box is not just a container, but a carrier of symbols. This combination of utility and aesthetics made their products particularly successful in the trade. But Phoenician art was not just decoration. It also had a deeper meaning. Many motifs were religious or symbolic. Bulls, lions, and eagles stood for strength and protection. Palmettes, lotus blossoms, and other plant motifs were associated with ideas of fertility and life. Divine figures such as Astarte or Melqart appeared in amulets or reliefs and made art a medium of the world of faith. Thus, every piece of jewelry, every ornament was also an expression of Phoenician culture and religion. The international appeal of Phoenician art is still visible today. Archaeological finds show that her works were spread from Assyria to Spain. In Greece and Etruria, Phoenician products were imitated, and even Rome later adopted forms and techniques that originally came from Phoenician workshops. In a way, Phoenician art became a catalyst for cultural exchange processes by spreading ideas, symbols, and techniques over wide spaces. This shows that the Phoenicians were not only traders, but also creative designers. Their art and craft connected worlds, bringing together materials from Africa, Asia, and Europe and turning them into works of timeless beauty. Ivory, metal, and glass were the materials they used to create a legacy that extended far beyond their political existence. Even when their cities were destroyed and their power broken, their works of art survived in the hands of other peoples and became ambassadors of a culture characterized by openness, diversity, and craftsmanship. Chapter 17: Language and Writing, from Phoenician to Hebrew and Greek. Perhaps the greatest and most momentous achievement of the Phoenicians was not their purple trade, not their ships, nor their mighty cities, but their writing. While many of their cultural achievements were lost in the storms of history, the Phoenician alphabet changed the world forever. It laid the foundation for the development of Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and thus most of the scripts used in the West today. Thus, a tool of merchants and seafarers became a heritage of immeasurable significance that shaped the foundations of our culture. The language of the Phoenicians was a Semitic dialect, closely related to Hebrew, Aramaic, and other languages of the ancient Near East. It was rich in consonants, while vowels were only clear through the use of language. In this respect, Phoenician was similar to its neighboring languages, but the decisive difference lay in the script. While Egyptians, Babylonians, or Hittites used complicated systems of hieroglyphics or cuneiform scripts that comprised hundreds of characters and were often only accessible to a small layer of scribes, the Phoenicians developed a system that was characterized by simplicity and practicality. an alphabet of only 22 characters that represented only consonants. This alphabet probably originated in the 2nd millennium BC and has been perfected over the centuries. It was revolutionary because it democratized writing. Anyone who knew the signs could learn and use them, without years of training. Merchants who wanted to catalog their goods, record contracts, or send messages needed a fast, efficient system, and the Phoenician alphabet met those exact needs. In the ports of Tyre, Sidon, or Byblos, in the camps of Cyprus or Spain, on the ships that crossed the Mediterranean, writing became an everyday tool. From there, the alphabet spread far beyond the Phoenician world. In Canaan, it became the foundation of Hebrew, taking many of its letter forms directly from Phoenician. Aramaic, which later became the lingua franca of the Middle East, also ultimately goes back to Phoenician models. However, the encounter between the Phoenicians and the Greeks was particularly momentous. In the 9th or 8th century BC, Greek traders and settlers adopted the Phoenician alphabet and adapted it to their linguistic needs. Since Greek had a clearer vowel structure, they filled in the missing vowels by reinterpreting certain Phoenician consonant signs. This creative step resulted in the first true alphabet that represented both consonants and vowels, a system that proved superior to all other writing systems. The significance of this development can hardly be overestimated. The Greek alphabet marked the beginning of the written tradition of Homeric epics, the emergence of classical literature, philosophy, and science. From there, the alphabet made its way into Latin and became the basis of Western written culture. Every page of a book we read today, every digital text we write, thus carries the legacy of Phoenician invention. But even beyond this great influence, the Phoenician script was an important cultural link. In the colonies of the Phoenicians, inscriptions appear documenting trade contracts, tombstones, or dedications. They are testimonies to a culture that understood writing not only as a sacred tool, but as an everyday necessity. While hieroglyphics were mainly used in religious and royal contexts in Egypt, the Phoenician merchant wrote his notes on shards, tablets, or papyrus. This ordinariness gave writing a new dimension and made it a practical tool for everyone. The language itself survived for many centuries, but lost importance with the rise of other Semitic languages such as Aramaic. In Carthage, a form of Phoenician known as Punic was also spoken. This language was also fixed in writing and left behind numerous inscriptions that show that the Phoenician alphabet was used until Roman times. Even in North Africa, the Punic persisted long after the destruction of Carthage, probably until the 5th century AD, and occasionally even beyond. The Phoenician script was not only a technical invention, but also an expression of a way of thinking. It stands for the pragmatic attitude of the Phoenicians, who strove for simplicity, efficiency, and usefulness in all areas. Just as their ships facilitated trade and their colonies secured the avenues of exchange, so did their alphabet facilitate communication. It was a tool for merchants and travelers, for people who crossed borders and created connections. The role of the Phoenicians as mediators of writing also remained present in the cultural memory of other peoples. The Greeks called their letters Phoenicia grammata, Phoenician signs, thus preserving the memory of their origins. This recognition is rare in the ancient world, where cultural takeovers were often concealed or reinterpreted. Here, however, the memory remained alive that the basis of their writing came from a small seafaring people from the Levant. Thus, the history of the Phoenician language and script is not only a chapter of antiquity, but a foundation of our present. It shows how a practical invention can change the world, how a small culture can leave behind a legacy greater than its political power or military strength through clever innovations. The Phoenicians did not leave behind an empire that lives on in stones or ruins. But they left us signs that we still use today, and that is a legacy that no conqueror could destroy. Chapter 18: Fall of the Cities, Alexander the Great and the Conquest of Tyre. The history of the Phoenicians is marked by rise, splendor, and cultural charisma, but also by a gradual weakening by the influences of powerful neighbors. While their colonies in the west, especially Carthage, were experiencing a new flourishing, the old cities on the Levant had increasingly been caught up in the maelstrom of the great powers of Mesopotamia, Persia, and finally Greece. The actual fall of the Phoenician cities can be summed up in a dramatic climax: the conquest of Tyre by Alexander the Great in 332 BC. This siege not only ended the political independence of the most important city of the Phoenicians, but also the chapter of a culture that had served for centuries as a mediator between the Orient and the Occident. For many centuries, Tyre had been the strongest and richest city of the Phoenicians. Located on an island off the coast, it was protected by mighty walls that rose up to 50 meters into the sky. This fortification made the city almost impregnable and had already caused other conquerors to despair. Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon had besieged the city for 13 years without being able to conquer it. The Persians had also subdued Tyre, but never destroyed it. Despite all its dependencies, Tyre remained a symbol of Phoenician resistance and independence. When Alexander the Great moved to the Middle East after his victories over Persia, Tyre was also on his campaign plan. He wanted to take control of the entire coast in order to secure his supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean. The Phoenician cities had hitherto sworn allegiance to the Persian king Darius III, and Alexander now demanded their submission. While Sidon and other cities gave in, Tyre refused to be loyal. The proud citizens refused to allow Alexander access to the city, counting on their walls and fleet to protect them. This marked the beginning of one of the most spectacular sieges of antiquity. Alexander, determined to break Tyre, had a gigantic dam built to fill up the sea between the mainland and the island. With thousands of workers, ships, and siege engines, a land connection was created that allowed the Greeks to drive their siege towers directly to the walls of the city. The Tyrians put up fierce resistance, used burning ships against the siege installations, and defended themselves with all their might. But Alexander's will and the discipline of his troops were stronger. After 7 months, the Macedonians managed to break through the walls. A bloodbath followed, which is described in the sources as one of the cruelest of antiquity. Tens of thousands of Tyrians were killed or enslaved, and the city itself was plundered and burned. Only a few survivors were allowed to stay, and with that the political and military importance of Tyre finally ended. What Nebuchadnezzar had failed to do, Alexander succeeded: the destruction of the last great symbol of Phoenician independence. The conquest of Tyre was not only a military event, but a turning point in the history of the Mediterranean. With the defeat, the Phoenicians lost their last chance to assert their ancient cities as independent powers. From then on, they were part of the Hellenistic world. Their language and culture were gradually superimposed by Greek and later Latin. Although Phoenician crafts and trade remained to a certain extent, the centers shifted. Carthage in the west finally took on the role of cultural and political heir, while the Levant became the province of larger empires. The fall of Tyre also had a symbolic meaning. The city, known for its walls, its invincibility, and its pride, fell not through internal weakness, but through the determination of one of the greatest generals in history. It was a triumph for the Greeks, a trauma for the Phoenicians. Centuries later, chroniclers still told of the destruction, and for the Romans it was a warning example of the price of resistance against overpowering opponents. But the history of the Phoenician cities did not end completely with Alexander. Sidon, Byblos, and other centers remained inhabited, their temples and workshops continued to function, and their merchants continued to exchange in the Mediterranean. But they no longer did so as independent powers, but in the shadow of the Hellenistic empires and later the Roman Empire. Their language and script were still used for a while, but Greek increasingly displaced them. The fall of the cities also shows the limits of the Phoenician way of life. A culture that relied on trade, diplomacy, and naval supremacy could not survive permanently in a world of land powers and conquerors. Their walls held for a long time, their diplomacy was skillful, but in the end they had no chance against the superiority of armies like Alexander's. So the Phoenicians were left with the role of cultural mediators and traders, not that of rulers or conquerors. Nevertheless, the fall of Tyre is not only an end, but also a transition. The Phoenician culture lived on in Carthage, which rose to become Rome's greatest rival. In art, religion, and above all in writing, the Phoenicians also left behind a legacy that went far beyond their political existence. Tyre itself was later rebuilt by the Romans and experienced a new heyday as a trading center in late antiquity. This shows that even in the destruction it was possible to continue to live, albeit in a different form. Alexander's conquest thus marks a double moment: the end of the old Phoenician cities and at the same time the beginning of their integration into a larger Hellenistic world. The Phoenicians did not disappear overnight, but became part of new structures that absorbed and transformed their traditions. But the memory of Tyre, its proud walls and its downfall remained as a memorial in the annals of history. Chapter 19: Afterlife of the Phoenicians, Traces in Rome and Christianity. Although the Phoenician cities in the Levant lost their political importance after the conquest by Alexander the Great in Carthage as a Western heritage was finally destroyed by Rome in the Punic Wars, the Phoenician people did not disappear from history without a trace. On the contrary, their cultural, economic, and religious legacies had an impact far beyond the decline of their political power and shaped both the Roman Empire and the world of early Christianity. In a way, Phoenician culture lived on in new forms, embedded in larger structures, but still recognizable. A central element of their afterlife was language. Punic, the Phoenician variant of Carthage, was spoken long after the destruction of the city in 146 BC. In North Africa, Punic remained alive until late antiquity, probably even until the 5th or 6th century AD. Church writers such as Augustine of Hippo mentioned that people still spoke Punic in their time. This made Phoenician one of the few ancient languages that survived the times of great political upheavals. The fact that Punic continued to exist in Christian communities in North Africa shows how deeply rooted the language was in the population, and how strong the cultural heritage of the Phoenicians remained even in the shadow of Rome. The Phoenicians also left traces in Roman everyday life. Numerous technical and artisanal traditions developed or disseminated by Phoenician craftsmen were adopted by the Romans. Glassblowing, purple dyeing, and the processing of ivory remained valued trades. Especially the purple from Tyre continued to be a symbol of power and dignity. Even Roman emperors wore purple robes, which went back to a technique that had been developed in Phoenician workshops. Thus, the prestige of the old cities lived on in a new imperial context. Religion was another field in which the aftermath of Phoenician culture remained noticeable. Many Phoenician deities were integrated into the Hellenistic and later Roman pantheon, or merged with their own counterparts. Melqart was equated by the Greeks with Heracles, Astarte with Aphrodite or Hera, Baal with Cronus or Saturn. These fusions did not mean the end of Phoenician religion, but its transformation. In new names and forms, the old gods remained alive. Their cults spread widely and were also practiced in the Roman world. A remarkable example of this continuity is the cult of Tanit in Carthage and North Africa. Even after the destruction of the city by Rome, she continued to be venerated, now in Roman garb. The integration of these deities shows that Rome was not only a conqueror, but also an adopter and transformer of traditions. Thus, Phoenician beliefs lived on in the cultural memory of the Mediterranean region, often unrecognized but effective. Traces of Phoenician culture can also be seen in Christianity. The coastal cities of the Levant, which were once Phoenician, were among the first regions where the gospel took root. Cities such as Tyre and Sidon appear in the New Testament, and Jesus himself is mentioned there several times. In the book of Acts, believers are mentioned in Phoenician cities, and early Christian communities were formed in these centers. Thus, the old Phoenician land became an important scene of the new religion that was soon to permeate the entire Mediterranean world. The Phoenician tradition as merchants and seafarers favored this process. Their ancient cities remained hubs of trade, and the same routes that once transported goods now spread ideas and beliefs. It was not least the traces of Phoenician infrastructure and mentality that helped early Christianity to spread. Even if the traders were no longer Phoenician, the way they traded was a legacy of the culture that had shaped the Mediterranean region for centuries. In addition, the image of the Phoenicians remained alive in Roman literature and historiography. On the one hand, the Romans saw them as dangerous opponents, as in the Punic Wars, and on the other hand, they admired their art, their ships, and their cunning. In the Aeneid, Virgil portrayed Dido as a tragic figure who is connected to Aeneas and thus also links the fate of Carthage with the founding of Rome. This literary treatment made the Phoenicians part of the Roman self-image. They were at the same time the fought, and yet part of their own myths of origin. The Phoenicians also left archaeological traces in the Roman Empire. Temple remains, inscriptions, and works of art were found in many parts of the Mediterranean region. Especially in North Africa, Punic symbols have passed into Roman contexts. Influences can even be seen in the architecture. The Roman port facilities and shipyards in the region were partly based on Phoenician models, and the famous Carthaginian ports with their circular docks were long considered a model for later Roman engineering. This shows that the Phoenicians did not simply disappear. Their afterlife was complex. Their traditions survived in language, religion, crafts, and infrastructure. In literature and mythology, they were immortalized as opponents and partners. In Christianity, their old cities found a new role. Even though they perished as a politically independent people, their cultural heritage remained deeply rooted in the structures of subsequent epochs. The afterlife of the Phoenicians is an example of how a culture continues to write even without a history of political power. While other peoples were forgotten because their achievements were tied to empires that were falling apart, the Phoenicians survived in the things they invented, in the ways they created, and in the myths that were told about them. Their traces reach into our time, not only in the writing we use, but also in the memory of their cities, their queen Dido, and their legacy as mediators between the worlds.